All right. We just finished our tests, and I finished doing the study guide. That's something I've been working on the last 30 minutes. So today we're going over chapter 7. We weren't supposed to do it last week, but I was unable to be here. So we're doing it today. We'll test on it in 2 weeks. Anyway, page 82, page number 82 in the book. Agriculture. When the Jewish people entered Canaan and took up agriculture after the semi-nomadic life of 40 years in the wilderness, they were entering into work that went back in their own history for hundreds of years and into a country that was extremely rich in plants. Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham had come from, was sustained by a healthy agricultural system based on irrigation ditches from the riverbank, stone plowshares, and flint sickles. With this technology, the Chaldeans grew 2 crops each season. Agriculture was also a feature of Egypt. Okay. To me, this is kind of, people grew stuff. Okay, it's been around for thousands of years, since early civilization. Each year, now we're specifically to Egypt here, each year the river Nile overflowed its banks, and the land was covered with fine river-borne silt that enriched the soil for the year. I would note that it's the Nile River, and that the river-borne silt enriched the soil for the year. So they relied on the Nile to flood, to overflow its banks, so that they would have that silt that would cover the ground and then enrich their soil for the crops. In the dry season, irrigation was used. Water was lifted from the Nile into ditches by a shaduf, or a sweep device, and directed by blocking off particular ditches with a system of mud walls that could be broken down again. All right, here we have the fertile banks of the River Nile near Cairo, Egypt. Okay. The Canaanite agriculture. There was no such regularity or certainty in Canaan. There, the success of agriculture depended not on the rise of great rivers, but on the winter rains, which varied from year to year, and on the conservation of water. Okay, so in Canaan, they didn't have, the Nile River is the longest river in the world. It's the greatest river in the world in terms of size and length, and regularly it happened every year. It would overflow its banks, and that would enrich their soil. They could depend on that every year to happen. All right, they didn't have that in Canaan, okay, or the Promised Land. They didn't have that in that area. So they depended on the winter rains and the conservation of water. Okay, so I would note that. All right, in Canaanite agriculture, they depended on the winter rains and then the conservation of water. So the water that they got during that time, the water that they were able to collect throughout the year, they had to conserve it so that they could have water throughout the rest of the year during the dry times. All right. The last word they're talking about Moses, and then it continues on page 86. Moses warned the Jewish people that the climate was uncertain and that their security was in God, who would provide the annual rainfall. So uncertain was the rainfall that the Canaanite religion was based on a form of sympathetic magic that ensured fertility for the soil. Bel, or Baal, however you want to pronounce it, was a storm god. Capricious water supplies were not the only thing that made Canaanite agriculture uncertain. Okay, so here in our text we're about to see 4 things. We've already seen one of them. 4 things, all right, that made agriculture in Canaan uncertain. Okay, so the first was the water supply. Okay, they couldn't always depend on it. All right, they had to be careful and conserve water. Okay, the second thing is the hot desert winds from the southeast scorched everything that grew. Okay, so the water supply, the hot desert winds. Another serious problem was the locusts. That's the third reason. Locusts, a large variety of grasshopper that swarmed in millions, and they ate everything green in its path. There is a terrible description of a plague of locusts in Joel chapter 2. It was a plague of locusts that attacked Egypt as one stimulus to let my people go. When the locusts arrived, they seemed to be like an all-avenging army, although they stayed put on a cold day. All right, and the fourth thing that made agriculture in Canaan uncertain was the erosion. Erosion was another problem. The winter rains tended to wash the covering of soil down from the hills, so retaining walls had to be built. Okay, so the water supply, hot desert winds, locusts, and erosion were the four things that made Canaanite agriculture uncertain. Farming began when it dawned on early man that instead of gathering wild grain and vegetables, it was possible to collect the seeds and to sow them in one place. The first sites used to grow crops were the places where the wild varieties grew, in well-watered and drained spots with adequate warmth and suitable soil. It was only with the development of farm implements and irrigation techniques that agriculture, began to advance. Okay, so at first, man was, they say we were hunters and gatherers, but, what's one of the first professions we see in the Bible? What's one of the first professions we see in the Bible?
No.
Okay, Abel was a shepherd. What was the other one?
A gardener.
Farmer, gardener. Okay, that's what Cain was. Okay, it was, this book kind of implies that, farming began when it dawned on early man that he no longer had to go and search and look for his food, but he could take what he found and he could plant it. Take the seeds from it and plant it. But the Cain and Abel, the first kids, so to speak, that were born to the human race, they were a shepherd and a farmer. But anyway, I get what the book is saying. So it did, as time went on, advancements were made. Farming, I say it got easier, but farming is tough work. Even with all the machinery of today, it's still some of the toughest work there is. Okay, the next paragraph, next section, there's the Gezer calendar. By the time the Jewish people dispossessed the Canaanites, there were a considerable number of crops. A boy from those days wrote an exercise of the 30 days half September variety, and it has been discovered in Gezer. It tells what was done through the year in agriculture. See opposite, so it's on page 87. So, the Gezer calendar, where was it found?
Gezer.
Okay. Good, that's not hard. So if there's a question on the test that says where was the Gezer calendar found, better not miss it. All right. With the ownership of sheep and perhaps some cattle, each on his own land, the farmer system could be called self-sufficient mixed farming. This changed in the early days of the Hebrew monarchy, as land was accumulated by the nobles at the expense of the original farmers. A system of royal tenants developed, and stewards were appointed to be in charge of vineyards, olive groves, granaries, and cattle raising. There were protests against the development from the prophets, and Nehemiah forced a return of property to its original owners. That kind of goes with, what we know about the year of Jubilee too. A situation that remained until the conquest of the country by the armies of Greece and Rome, when it was possible to amass land again. Using the ancient schoolboy's calendar exercise, we will now look at some of the things that were grown. Okay, so on the Gezer calendar, all right, it talks about the different months, different times of the year when certain crops would be grown or when they would be harvested. So in September and October, so around this time of the year, is when you see the olive harvest. All right, then in November and December, they're planting grain. January and February, that's for late planting, I guess, of grain. The month of March is used to hoe up the flax. April is the barley harvest. So that's what would have been planted back in November, December, January, and February. Then the month of May is harvest and festivity. And then the 2 months of June and July are for tending the vines. And then the month of August is for summer fruit. All right, a little note down there. It says the planting in January and February was millet, peas, lentils, melons, and cucumbers. So the barley harvest, that's what would have been planted in September and October, or rather November and December. Okay.
So kind of like a farmer's almanac.
Yeah. Okay, the grain crops. The two most important grains were wheat and barley, but millet was grown as well. I would underline that. Wheat and barley were the main ones, but millet was also another grain that was grown. Wheat grew in the coastal Philistine plain, the Jordan Valley, and the Valley of Jezreel. Barley, or what was known as poor man's wheat, could be grown on poorer soil and needed a shorter growing season, and it was less valued as a crop than wheat. The cycle of grain production began when the former rains came in October and November and softened page 90, the soil sufficiently for it to be worked. The rains then continued intermittently and heavily throughout the winter. Joel calls them the autumn rains and the spring rains. Without rain, the plow could not be used because the soil would be baked hard in the summer sun. So if there wasn't any rain, you couldn't do the plowing because the ground was hard as rock. I might note that sentence there. Without rain, the plow could not be used because the soil would be baked hard in the summer sun. It was not pleasant work because the winter rains were heavy and cold, and it was always tempting to wait for warmer days. Yeah, getting out there in the field with the winter rains, you'd be wet, you'd be cold. Yeah. All right. Okay, we'll do page 88 and 89 first. Plowing. Plowing and sowing were often one operation. Okay, so as they go about plowing the field, at the same time you might have someone there with you, or you might even be doing it yourself. You have the plow going and you'd be sowing the seed as you plow the field. I might note that, and I would note that about it. Plowing and sowing were often one operation. The grain was scattered from an open basket and replenished from a sack tied on the back of a donkey. It took about 30 pounds of seed to the half acre, although the Babylonians had invented a primitive seed drill that was in use in some places and was more economical with the seed. The seed was then plowed in so that it would not be taken by the birds. The method of sowing underlies the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, where there was a hard path and thorns awaiting the plow. The plow itself was made of two wooden beams joined T fashion. The horizontal stroke of the T formed the handle for the guidance, and the spiked end was to break the surface of the ground. The vertical section of the T was attached to the yoke that went over the necks of the animals. The yoke itself was simply a rough beam tied across the necks of a pair of animals and held in place by two vertical sticks that came down each side of the neck and tied beneath. See Jeremiah 20:13. Okay, so what you have down here, depicted here, is a pretty good illustration. But a real primitive design is going to be on page 90. That's about as primitive as it gets. That's a very rough looking plow, and it looks like that is all rocks that he's plowed through there on page 90.
Poor donkey. Look at him.
Yeah.
He's tired.
I mean, that's a donkey and a cow.
Both of them look like
I
that.
feel like they're both cows.
No, that one's a donkey.
No.
That's not a donkey.
No, right here.
Oh, okay. I was like, wait.
On page
Oh yeah, we're looking on
90.
page 90.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh,
I was like, that is not a donkey.
oh yeah.
It's a
And
donkey
that's
and a cow.
definitely a donkey.
Now, what we're about to look
Sad
at,
donkey.
what we're about to look at in the next paragraph on this page, this is wrong. Okay, even though they're the same size, so it might not be that bad. You weren't supposed to use two different animals because you might cause them to be unequally yoked,
Mhm.
and it might cause more work for one, and it might even cause an injury to the one that's just kind of there along for the ride.
This poor guy's just got it all messed up. He's
Yeah.
in rocks, and he's got a cow and a
That's a
donkey.
woman.
That is a dude.
You see where it's at? Arab woman.
Is it?
It sure enough does.
Yeah.
An Arab woman plows her field with a bullock.
Oh, because it looks like there's a mustache on her.
Right, what do they got Muslim?
That might just be the
Be a
shadow.
shadow. Okay.
You see look.
Whatever.
About to say it might be easier to discern if she was smiling, but I don't know if I'd be smiling.
Yeah, that
She
looks
ain't
awful
happy.
terrain.
She don't look too happy.
All right, back on page 90. No, excuse me, 89. The animals used were oxen if possible, and if a bull was used, it was castrated. All right, and that's to keep issues from rising. You don't want a bull to,
Get the smell and take off.
right. The law forbade a mixture of animals such as ox and donkey, presumably because there would be an unequal pull that might cause suffering for the weaker animal. The regulation prohibiting partnership between believers and unbelievers in 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be yoked together with unbelievers as pertaining to marriage, was not simply exclusivist. It was made out of the knowledge of the suffering that could be caused. That's a really good thing to know, the parallel between why you would do it, why it was important to not be unequally yoked with your animals pulling the plow, is, kind of is the same reason with, being in a relationship. There can be issues caused and suffering if an unbeliever or a believer rather is yoked with an unbeliever. The amount of land that a pair of oxen could plow in a day became a standard measurement. In the early days of agriculture, the sharp end of the plow was little more than a heavy pointed stick. A great advance was made when copper was able to be smelted and a copper sheath or blade attached to the spike. An even greater advance was made when the Philistines brought iron to the land, even if this meant the Jews had to get their plowshare sharpened by the Philistines. That's because only the Philistines knew how to sharpen it and work it. So in the early days, all you had was just a wooden spike, and then with the advancement that was allowed them to smelt copper, right? You could have a full copper piece, or what they would do would just take a copper sheath or like a flat piece and put it on that wooden spike, and that would help. And then of course being able to have just an iron plowhead was a big advancement. And I would know that those were the advancements that were made there: copper and iron. Or specifically that copper could be smelted into a plowshare or into a copper sheet to put on the wooden spike, and then of course the advancement or the introduction of iron by the Philistines. All right, page 90, plows. The early plows were light. Although they were portable and could be carried for some distance on shoulder, they could scratch the surface of the ground to a depth of only 3 or 4 inches. The reason the plowman must not look back was not because he would fail to plow in a straight line. Rather, it was because he needed all his concentration so that he might push down hard and dig deep enough into the ground. He had to watch for stones and boulders too, since they could wreck so light a tool, although the lightness did mean that he could lift the plow over the obstacle. Okay, so they weren't to look back once they put their hand to the plow. That's what it talks about, in Christian ministry and working for the Lord. Once you put your hand to the plow, don't look back, don't turn around, look behind you, just keep your eyes ahead. All right, the reason that the plowman was to do that, not necessarily only for him to plow in a straight line, okay, but what's it say here? He needed all of his concentration so that he could push down and dig deep enough into the ground, or else he's just going to be riding on the top of it and not dig deep enough for the seeds to be able to take root at the right depth. And then what was the other reason listed there? So that he could look out for what?
Stones and stuff.
Stones and boulders. All right. Plowing was sometimes done in a team, each team contributing its own plow and oxen until the fields of the whole village were covered. I would note that plowing was sometimes done in a team, each team contributing its own plow and oxen until the fields of the whole village were covered. Elisha was plowing with 11 other people and 24 oxen when he was called to his prophetic ministry. They were doing some heavy work there. Plows could not be used on the hillside, near trees, or on exceptionally hard land. So, where could plows not be used?
Near trees or hard land.
Hillsides.
Hillside, near trees, or exceptionally hard ground. In such cases, a mattock was used, a hand tool like a hoe with a blade set at right angles to the shaft. There was an alternative method of sowing and plowing where the ground would be plowed first and sown afterwards. This would require a further plowing at right angles to the first, or else a harrowing by pulling a large bush behind a team of oxen. Okay, so they would plow it, they would go and sow the seed, and they would come along at a right angle and plow again. Okay, I guess that would allow the seed to get sown back into the ground. If the oxen were unwilling to move or were too slow for the farmer, he would encourage them to move by prodding them with a sharp pointed stick or goad. Goad, I would know that word. It's a sharp pointed stick or goad. It was heavy enough to be used as an effective weapon. So it wasn't like a little piece of bamboo or a switch. It was something heavy, something that could be used as a weapon. Jesus used a symbolic goad to push Paul forward to the point of conversion. In Acts 26:14, I think that's when he's accounting his conversion. He talks about how he had been told it is hard for you to kick against the goads, or it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks, is another translation there. Okay. The wheat, often called corn in the King James Version of the Bible. Okay, now that's an important thing to know. Okay, corn. When was corn discovered?
In the Greek.
The Pilgrims, when they came to America. Okay, so when it talks about corn, if you read the word corn in the Bible, it's talking about wheat. Yeah, Europeans and they didn't know what corn was until they came to the Americas. All right, the wheat was sown first, then the barley, then the other crops followed, which could be the millet, the lentils, peas, melons, and cucumbers. It was necessary to keep the ground free of weeds by hoeing from December until February. So from during that time, they had to hoe up the weeds to keep the ground free. This was a time when, except in the hill country, movement from place to place was impossible because the rains turned the plains into a muddy morass. Then, as the temperature began to rise at the end of March and the beginning of April, the spring rains came. The rains caused the grain to swell. By the end of April, the barley was ready for harvesting. This is all just good information. I don't think any of what we just read in that paragraph is going to be on the test. Or if it is, it'd be in the form of a bonus question. So, harvest fields were divided by paths, and it was permitted to pick the ears of the growing corn beside the path. This was particularly enjoyed in the spring before the grain had hardened. The 12 disciples who were with Jesus at the ripening grain ate the ripening grain one Sabbath day. They were not criticized for taking the grain because this was allowed in the law. It was thought by some people, however, that even picking the grain could be considered working on the Sabbath. All right, we passed a lot of pictures, and we looked over quite a bit as far as like maps and stuff go. So back on page 83, there's a relief map of Palestine. This is just what it's really pointing out here is the elevation. Okay, so as far as like the hills, and you got your little meter at the bottom that tells you the colors and in what correlation to the elevation. So I mean, it goes from 3,200 feet at some points all the way down to below sea level. So I mean, when you think of how this area is very mountainous, okay, it goes from really high to really low. All right, and then we have the full page map, which is of the Fertile Crescent and modern boundaries. So the like the red line, the red dotted line is the modern boundaries that are on today's maps. And then you have the economy of the ancient Near East. So you see what kind of animals, what kind of produce would have been. So let's see. Of course, we know in Israel, fishing was a very big industry during the time of Jesus. There on the Sea of Galilee, and especially in the Mediterranean as well. Horse breeding. Persia. So one thing you notice about the fruit growing, which would have been your dates, your figs, and your olives, you really only see those happening in Israel, and then up kind of further like where Antioch would have been in the New Testament, kind of further up the eastern coast of the Mediterranean there. So that's really the only area you see fruit grown. And of course, you only see grain production where? What's one thing you got to have to grow grain? What'd you say? Water. So you see it. That's why all around the rivers and the coast, it's green. All right. You got a map on page 86 talking about the rainfall in Palestine. I guess doesn't really give you measurements, just kind of telling you the terrain or the biomes of the areas. A lot of it is forest, scrub, grassland, scrub. Never heard that word used in that sense, scrub. Desert, of course, and sand dunes, and oasis. Very cool. All right, then rivers and streams. I mean, when you look at this right here, you see that there's a lot of streams in Israel, in that area. You know, they might not be as they're streams, you know, smaller, nothing like the River Jordan, which isn't as big. You know, it is wide and deep at some points, but it's not really a big river. It's not like even like the Pearl River or anything like that. It's probably not as impressive as some people would think. And of course, we saw the good pictures of the plows and the animals there. All right, page 92. We see some folks doing some work here. The far right on page 92, they're harvesting wheat manually in fields near Shaham, Israel. And then the picture there, an Arab woman preparing the soil, breaking up clods of earth ready for seeding. I think that's what they call in the book a mattock. That's what she's using there. Back on page 91, they reference the mattock. And then we have down there the illustration, a farmer of Bible times harvest with an iron sickle. Of course, iron was introduced by the Philistines, so it would have been after the time of when the kingdom was established. All right, harvesting, page 93. The flax was harvested in March and April by cutting the stems with a hoe at ground level. As soon as that was completed, the barley was ready for harvesting. The standing grain was cut by the sickle, a hand-held crescent-shaped tool with a sharp inner cutting edge. So what is a sickle?
It's like it's a crescent shape.
Like a machete.
Okay, all right, be able to describe it. It's on text. So you can give the definition right there, okay? Under harvesting on page 93. The standing grain was cut by sickle, a hand-held crescent-shaped tool with a sharp inner cutting edge.
If we said on the test, would you know what we meant?
If you're able to spell that,
Okay, I got you.
I have faith in you. You did.
Yeah, let's just learn the actual answer.
as long as you give something along that line. In early times, the implement would be made of wood or even the large jawbone of an animal. So at earlier times, it would have been made from wood, then from the jawbone of an animal, and flints would be set along the inner edge. Later in time, metal sickles were available. All right, the stalks were cut near to the top and the remainder left in the ground for the grazing of the sheep. So when it came to the flax or the grain, whatever was, because the only thing they really needed was the grain at the top. So they would cut it below that and they leave the rest for the animals. They were tied into bundles, loaded onto the backs of donkeys, or put into a cart to be taken away for threshing. Occasionally, the grain would be pulled out of the ground. The grain was normally cut by a group of people working together. All right, I would note this part here. But the corners of the fields had to be left for the poor. That was in the law. And they had to leave the corner of the fields for the poor. The poor were also allowed to walk behind the reapers to pick up or glean anything the reapers had missed. The story of Ruth is set against such a background. She was able to fill the large skirt of her robe with what she had collected. It's not only, of course, people wouldn't do, that's not something you see nowadays. They may still do it in the Middle East, maybe. But one thing I've seen when they're harvesting, cutting hay, grass for hay, is, and the birds know. They hear it. A lot of times they'll follow tractors. And when they start going out and they start cutting the hay, and especially when they're they got the turners and it gathers it into lines for them then to go and bale it, you'll see birds following because animals get caught in there. it exposes all kinds of stuff for them to get into. I'm not comparing the poor to animals here, but that's one thing that kind of, I guess, a modern parallel. You kind of see even the animals, they know what's going on. All right, the last paragraph there, and I would note this first sentence as well. The grain was tender dry at the time of reaping, and there was a danger of fire. That danger was often exploited by enemies in war, and the knowledge that such burning would seriously weaken the condition of the people who own the crops. So during times of war, when the reaping happened and they would go and harvest, they would very much likely post guards around these fields, because if your crops went up in flames and fire, well, that was a severe hit, because you lost food, which you need to keep your army going and keep people fed. All right, threshing. The separation of the grain from the straw was done on a threshing floor. This could be any hard, compacted surface. It may have been made of smooth rock, as presumably was the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, or of compacted earth. The earthen threshing floors were often covered with grass and became an ideal place to pitch a tent. They were known as summer threshing floors. So, a threshing floor needed to be a place where the ground, and often the ground would become compacted in a threshing floor by having had it done before right here. Okay, so it's like walking a trail, okay, or following a game trail. It's something that's walked often. The ground is packed down. You can feel the difference walking on it as compared to taking a step off it and walking in the grass to the side. It's still soft and loose, and then you step back on the trail. It's hard and it's compacted. So that's where the threshing would take place. It'd be a big circular area. Threshing was sometimes done by beating the grain with a flail, which was just a long, flexible stick, if small quantities were involved. So if you just needed to thresh a small quantity, you would just use that flail. Ruth used this method, and Gideon did the same when he was using the stone bottom of a wine press. The psalmist imagines doing this to his enemies in Psalm 18:42. Oxen were the other means of threshing grain. A pair was yoked together, and the yoke attached to a vertical pole set in the middle of the threshing floor. They were driven round and round by a boy, and their sharp hooves did the rest. The law said that the oxen should not be muzzled when doing this kind of work, so that they could eat. And the New Testament uses this to lay down the principle that ministers of the gospel should always be able to live from their ministry. The root meaning of the Hebrew word for thresh is to trample, which comes from this second threshing practice. So, like the oxen would trample on the grain, and they would separate the grain from the chaff. And that's what you kind of see up here in the illustration on top of page 94. 2 oxen drag a heavy threshing sledge across the straw to separate off the grain. And of course, back on page 93, you had a picture of a threshing sledge made of wood with stone studs. This would be dragged over the ground by oxen or donkeys to separate the grain from the straw. And then down here on same page, a threshing floor in the Jordan Valley. All right. Later, the threshing sledge was invented, which the oxen pulled behind them, rather as they would have pulled a plow. Sledges were made of long planks of wood fixed side by side. Flints were sunk into the underside of the timber and fixed there by pitch. The sledge was driven over the grain about 18 inches in depth and was a much quicker way of getting the job done. The grain fell through the straw to the hard surface beneath, but the straw was chopped up by this method. Chopped straw made excellent fodder for animals for mixing with the grain. Later, still a more sophisticated sledge was invented, in which sets of tooth rollers replaced the flints. Very interesting stuff. So interesting. I'll put you to sleep. Okay, so we'll take a break, and we might finish the chapter. Maybe. Yeah, maybe. All right. Left off on page 94. All right, storage. The day after winnowing, the grain would be measured into standard earthenware receptacles that took their names from their capacity. So that happened the day after winnowing. The grain would be measured. I would underline that sentence. Now, of course, it kind of gets out of order a little bit here because they talk about after winnowing, and then it's on the next two pages right here that we have the process of winnowing. Okay, so winnowing happens. Winnowing, it's a hard word to say. It's a silly word, kind of. It sounds like a silly word. Winnowing. So that happens before storage. Okay, which now that I'm sitting here making a deal about it, we're going to go ahead and look at winnowing first. Okay, so page 96. Winnowing. In the evening after the threshing, when the breeze developed, the separated grain and straw was gathered into a pile in the center of the threshing floor for winnowing. For this, the farmer used a pronged fork called a winnowing fan and a spade that was called a winnowing shovel. The fork was first used by putting it into the pile and throwing the mixture of grain and straw into the air. The heavier grain fell back while the straw was blown away by the wind. When the remainder was too small to be picked up by the fork, the shovel was used for the same purpose. If there was no wind, it was possible, while winnowing small quantities, to create wind by wafting a piece of matting. The chaff was gathered up and used to fire the domestic stoves. The straw was collected for the animals. Okay, so what they're saying there, of course, we have a great picture of it right there. Okay, that's their winnowing. If you're doing a small quantity, you could do it, and you could have someone sitting there waving a mat or a fan. Let's see. I thought at one point there might have been a picture, but maybe it was just one I'd seen online before. But like in modern times, when they winnow small quantities, they'll set on a table. They'll have like a fan, like a box fan. They'll turn it on high, and they'll throw it across the fan. The grain will fall down into the receptacle below it, and then the rest will be blown out of the way by the fan. So that's really easy compared to what was involved. You had to have a companion then there to fan it for you. The grain then had to be purified by sifting. The wheat and barley grains were mixed with all kinds of loose fragments from the threshing floor. Everything was put into large sieves that allowed the grain to pass through but left most of the rubbish behind. It was also necessary to remove any darnel grains at this stage. Darnel was called tares or weeds in the New Testament. It looks identical to wheat until the grain ripens, when it becomes black instead of yellow. The grains are bitter and cause dizziness and sickness of eating. That kind of scares me a little bit because yesterday I was eating sunflower seeds on the way up to school. And, pop a handful in my mouth and just eat them one at a time. And there was one I could tell when I cracked it that it was weird. I should have spit it out, but I ended up, I got the seed out, started chewing on it, and I knew as soon as I crunched down on it, it was bad. And then of course, throughout my whole mouth, I just get this. It tasted more burnt than anything, but it was bad. So now I'm sitting there trying to spit that out and driving 70 miles per hour up the highway, heavy traffic, but it was a life or death situation. So anyway, the picture of the separation of good and bad was used as a picture of what God will do to judge people. The whole process was used by John the Baptist to illustrate the work of Jesus. When Jesus said that Satan wanted to sift Peter like wheat, he was probably referring to the physical shaking of the sieve, or sieve, however you want to pronounce it. When this part of the work was done, the farmer normally stayed with the grain at night, camping out on the threshing floor to ensure that the harvest was not stolen. So here on this page we have a really good illustration. A peasant winnows grain. Notice that the laborer in the background has girded up his loins. Takes us all the way back to chapter 1. All right, a sieve down here used for separating the grain from the chaff. And then right there, we're going to see have one of those in person here before too long. A wooden winnowing fork similar to that used in the illustration to the right.
Check it out.
All right, now, storage. The day after winnowing, the grain would be measured in the standard earthenware receptacles that took their names from their capacity. As much as possible was put into a receptacle until it overflowed. The grain was then stored, small quantities in earthenware jars, and larger quantities in a dry pit or cistern, in a room attached to the house, or even in a barn. I would underline that, the different storage places that we see there. Small quantities were in earthenware jars, larger quantities were in a dry pit or cistern, in a room attached to the house, so they might have had a room in the house specifically for that, or they may have had a barn. There were also public storage granaries and public grain silos. There, Genesis 41:48 is there. Joseph in Egypt, they store grain because they know there's a famine coming, and they store it in the grain silos. There were a number of ways of keeping pests away. The storehouses were built of brick with thick walls, and the only way in was through a hole on the top of the building. I would underline that sentence. The storehouses were built of brick with thick walls, and the only way in was through a hole on the top of the building. The insides of the walls were plastered. Such storehouses were used to provide a central place to receive the offerings that supported the ministry. 1/10 of the produce of the land, both fruit and crops, had to be offered. Of course, we see all kinds of different fruit and crops mentioned in those offerings. We are not aware of fertilizers being used for grain crops, although animal manure was sometimes used in other places. The land was instead given a rest every seventh or Sabbath year. So I would note that. Definitely a question on the test. God promised a bumper harvest in the 6th year to enable people to live through the 7th. So in that 6th year, they would receive even more. Whatever grew in the 7th year was the property of the poor. This law was not kept in the early days of the kingdom, and the chronicler saw the exile as the means of giving the land its stolen Sabbath days. So the exile was partially to give the land the rest that they had robbed it of in the days before the exile. After the exile, Nehemiah attempted to restore the practice of resting the land. So after the exile, it was Nehemiah that attempted to restore the practice of resting the land. So if there's a question that says which Old Testament prophet attempted to restore the practice of resting the land, it's Nehemiah. And it was in operation during the Greek period. So you see that practice in the time of the Greeks. In 163 and 162 BC, the Jews lacked provisions, for it was a Sabbath year granted to the land. All right, vegetables and other crops. Flax was grown to provide linen thread. The spies who visited Jericho in Joshua's time hid under flax stalks that were laid out to dry on the roof of a house. Linen thread was used for spinning, but Isaiah disliked the linen garments that were often produced because their transparency led to sexual stimulation. Cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic were probably brought from Egypt, and many crops were grown so that their green leaves could be eaten, such as mallow, sorrel, and artichokes. Beans and lentils were used to thicken stews. All right, vines. According to Genesis 9:20, Noah was the first person to cultivate the vine after the flood. I would note that. At the personal level, every Jew wanted to have his own vine. It would be grown on a trellis alongside his house and would provide shade during the hot summer. Having a vine was part of a settled life, and therefore rejected by the Rechabites, who wanted to bear witness to the nomadic way of life. It was most economical for a village to invest in its own vineyard. I would note that. Most economical for a village to invest in its own vineyard. In good vine-growing country, however, the small vineyards were bought up by absentee landlords, and the small-time farmers became tenant farmers, receiving a percentage of their produce as payment. The developer of the vineyard, therefore, became a major capital undertaking. It was already well developed when Moses sent spies into Canaan. You know, it talks about, I always joke about Mom Donna's replica over here, that those grapes there look like they were brought out of Canaan. The ones that the spies had to bring back, you know, carrying on a rod because they were so heavy. All right. Building a vineyard. Isaiah 5:1-2 outlines the process of building a vineyard. So which Old Testament prophet outlines the process of building a vineyard? Isaiah. And it gives the verses there. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. The vineyard was placed on the hillside where there was good drainage and where the grapes could catch the sun. The land was first terraced so as to use up the stones that littered the soil, at the same time providing a means of soil conservation during the heavy rains. That would keep the soil from running off with the rain. The plot was then surrounded by a wall and a ditch, and excavated soil from the ditch forming the foundation for the wall. A fence of thorns was placed on top of the wall to keep out any damaging wild animals. Psalm 80 verses 12-13 mention human beings who might raid the vineyard to steal the fruit, although the law allowed grapes to be picked so long as they were not carried away in a container. The soil, page 100. The soil was prepared by turning it over with a mattock. Finally, a watchtower was constructed that served as a summer cottage, a place for the family to stay during the summer while the grapes were being picked. It was not a cheap thing to build. Jesus once told a story of a man whose money ran out during the building of a tower. The upper story of the tower was used as a lookout post. If the owner could not afford a tower, the workers set up a tent, kind of like what we see on the last page, a makeshift watchtower in terraced fields near the hill town of Bethlehem. Well, that says watchtower, so that may be bigger than what it looks in the picture. On page 98, a terraced hillside near Bethlehem. Terracing allows the farmer to make use of steep hillsides with their plentiful sunlight. We see a picture there of a lady harvesting the grapes. My Mimi and Papa, they actually grow grapes at their little farm. I say little farm, it's actually become a pretty big production over the last couple of years since my Mimi retired. But they don't grow they don't have a big vineyard. They just grow up. They have one trellis that they grow them on. But, and I find them kind of sour. I guess they're young, so who knows how long it takes for them to get to the point where they could be eaten like what we're used to in size. Alrighty. The slips were planted up to about 12 feet apart to give the branches room to run. If the vineyard was on flat ground, there was sufficient space to get a plow between the rows. Some varieties were left to run on the ground, but others were supported on rough trellises of forked sticks. Once the vines were established, pruning was done with a small pruning hook. During the winter months, to get rid of weak, broken, or diseased branches, so that the vine would produce the best possible grapes. This process was referred to as cleaning the vine. We are being pruned or made clean by the teaching that Jesus has given to us. In this next part, I would underline good branches that are not doing very well are taken away from the ground and put into a better position, more favorable for producing good fruit. All right, the vintage. Well, let's look at this little green box at the top first. Swords and the plowshares. Joel speaks of people preparing for war who beat their plowshares into swords and their pruning hooks into spears. Isaiah 2:4 and Micah 4:3 speak of peace, where people beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Metal was so scarce at the time that there was a need for change of use. So if you're looking at a time of peace, you would take your sword, make it into a plowshare, and you would take your spear and make it into a pruning hook, and there came a time of war, you would do the opposite. All right, the vintage. Okay, we're making decent time. The vintage. The vintage begins in July but lasts until September. The whole village may move to the vineyards because the work has to be completed quickly. Okay, so the vintage has to be completed quickly. So what happens? The whole village moves to the vineyards. Harvesting grapes was hard work during Bible times, but there was singing, dancing, and celebration. So singing, dancing, and celebration accompanied the vintage. And the celebrations were so much a part of the vintage that if they were absent, it would be seen as a mark of God's judgment. Everyone brought huge baskets in which the grapes were placed. Right, then we have four ways that we see the grapes used or consumed. Some grapes were eaten fresh or pressed to provide fresh grape juice. The butler in Joseph's dream interpretation pressed a bunch of grapes into Pharaoh's cup. Fresh grape juice was used for laxative purposes. Some of the juice was also made into wine, known as sweet wine. Other grapes were dried so as to provide raisins. Right? This is the process of making raisins. They were laid out in a corner of the vineyard, turned daily, and sprinkled with olive oil. David received large quantities of raisins on a number of occasions because they were a staple food. There were far too many grapes to all be utilized in raisin making. Most were pressed for their juice. Okay? And the juice would then be made into wine. The wine press. The wine press was a cistern cut out of rock with an exit hole in the bottom. The juice ran out of the hole into a vat or other collecting vessels. Several people at once would get into the cistern and tread the grapes with their feet to great laughter and enjoyment. The first part of Isaiah 65:8, it reads, "As when juice is still found in a cluster of grapes and men say, 'Don't destroy it, there is yet some good in it,' may be part of one of the songs that were sung during the process." Like Isaiah, Jeremiah sees judgment in the time when there is no joy or singing as the grapes are pressed. I would note that. Like Isaiah, Jeremiah sees judgment in the time when there is no joy or singing while the grapes are being pressed. every time I think of wine, like pressing the grapes and like what we see here, people getting in there and stepping on them, I think of the Duck Dynasty episode where Willie buys a vineyard and he wants to make wine, but they don't have no wine grapes, so he goes and he buys grapes from the grocery store and gets those big hairy men in there to trample on those grapes. Well, I'll say that I think Miss K may have helped for a little bit, but I don't know about that. Yeah, I imagine it'd be fun, but if I were a wine drinker, I don't think I would buy that vintage. All right. Isaiah presents a sad picture of a man who was treading grapes alone because all of his companions had gone. So he didn't have anybody to dance and to sing with him. An even more violent picture of judgment is given when people are placed in God's winepress and trodden upon. God's robes are covered with blood instead of red grape juice. Some grape juice was boiled down to make a thick syrup called dibs. This may well be what is called honey in most places in the Bible. That is because bees were not kept in hives until Roman times. Regular honey was taken from wild bees. The honey that flowed in the land is therefore more likely to be related to the grape. It is sometimes spread on bread and sometimes diluted with water to make a drink. So, Bible Kool-Aid. Bible time Kool-Aid. Most of the grape juice was made into wine. This was done, I would note this, why it was a necessity. This was not simply for pleasure, it was a necessity. Why? The water was unsafe for drinking unless it came from a fresh spring, and the milk supply was limited. So, why was wine making a necessity? Again, water was undrinkable, water was mostly unsafe unless it came from a fresh spring.
You know, a lot of this stuff we're going over has been back in some of the other same chapter.
Good call.
When Paul told Timothy that he should drink a little wine for his stomach's sake, it was not necessarily because the wine would do his stomach good, but because the water might do it harm.
Yeah, that was not right.
Wine making. The grape juice was allowed to stand and ferment in the collecting vessels for about 6 weeks. A sludge known as lees formed at the bottom of the vessel. The wine was then tipped up gently into jars without disturbing the sediment. The jars were sealed with clay, but there was a small hole by the handle that allowed the gases released during the remaining fermentation to escape. Yeah, you didn't want anything like that to explode. When the process was complete, the hole was sealed with a blob of wet clay, and the owner's name or seal was put on the clay. It was possible to put the wine in wineskins or goatskin bottles, but if the aged skin did not expand to take the gases, then it would burst and the wine would be lost. This is the point of Jesus' illustration in Matthew 9:17. Let's look at that. Matthew 9, verse 17. Neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out, and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved. Okay. In New Testament times, wines were imported into Judea from all over the Mediterranean world. The rich had cellars in their houses and stored the wine in narrow jars with pointed ends called amphora. So it's no different than today. People have wine cellars in their house. But here is what we see. These are the amphora up here. And the, let's see if it's pictured here. At the top, of course, at the opening is where the wet clay would be put, and that's where they would take their seal and press it upon it, so you'd know where the wine was coming from. You know, they didn't have printing labels back then to roll onto their amphora, so they put their seal upon it. Okay. The pointed ends. The pointed ends were buried in the earth to help keep the wine cool. Wine was also made from dates, pomegranates, apples, and grain. The wine made from the grain is probably referred to as fermented drink in the Bible. There were a number of uses for wine beside the obvious, which would be drinking. So know these, the different or other uses for wine. It was used as a disinfectant to clean wounds before inserting the healing olive oil. The cheap wine, or the soldier's wine, produced before the fermentation was completed in the clay storage jars. Okay, so far, one of the reasons we see is disinfectant. And the next one we see is it was mixed with myrrh and gall so as to relieve pain. So there's two other reasons right there. All right, vine symbolism. The vine was of great importance in the religion of Israel. It was used as a symbol of the religious life of Israel itself. And the carving of a bunch of grapes often adorned the front exterior of the synagogue. The symbolism was based upon passages such as Psalm 80 and Isaiah 5:1-5, where Israel is God's vine. The importance of the vine is why the Pharisees took the point so angrily when Jesus told the story of the wicked tenants in the vineyard. As the fulfillment of all that Israel should be to God, Jesus was the true vine. The vine was also important because it brought out teaching about right and wrong usage. Wine was one of the good things that God gave, and as such was to be offered back to Him in thanksgiving. That's one thing that me and Brother BJ actually looked at last night, was wine was used in the offerings to the Lord. And at one spot it talks about wine, and then in the next word it's talking about strong drink. So it's not talking about, Welch's grape juice. It's talking about, strong drink, strong wine. If a farmer lived too far from the central sanctuary to deliver the wine tithe, it was to be sold and used to buy something to thank God for. Wine was, however, to be abstained from for disciplinary purposes. A Nazirite took no fruit of the vine at all. John the Baptist took no wine, and it was forbidden for priests when they went into the presence of God. Wine could be used for good, as we see in those verses, or for evil, as we see in those verses. That Genesis 9:21 is the account with Noah being drunken and he's seen by his was it Shem or Ham? I think it was. Okay. It was merely the behavioral excesses associated with wine drinking that were condemned in the Bible, and not the drinking of wine itself. Those verses to go along with it. All right. Olive growing. Or here, before we move on to olives, the bottom left picture, decorative relief from the old Capernaum synagogue depicting grapes. And the top one is this Roman oil lamp is decorated with a scene of the vintage. I would really like to know what that lamp is made out of, or if it's just painted and been preserved for that long. Olive growing. Olive trees were associated with vines. They too were a vital element of the food supply. Psalm 128:3 speaks of God's blessing on families that trust Him. Reads, "Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your sons will be like olive shoots around your table." The family olive tree could be grown beside the family home on the inheritance, but with the passage of time, olive groves were planted alongside the vineyards and the grain fields when the oil was used to pay taxes. Olives grew so well that the land was sometimes called a land of olive oil. Olive trees were grown by inserting a graft from a cultivated tree into a wild stock. I would note that sentence there. Olive trees were grown by inserting a graft from a cultivated tree into a wild stock.
What does that mean?
So you would just take a a branch or a cutting from a tree that was a good tree, had been grown, and you would just take it and graft it into an old, or say old or new, a wild stock. So you'd have one it's been growing, it's been cultivated, it's been taken care of, and you would take it to a wild olive shoot, and you would graft it in. You know what grafting is? It's where they would cut it in, and they would take that new cutting, and they would put it there, and they wrap it to where it would then graft and grow from that shoot or stump or stalk or whatever. So, the wild stalk was then cut down to the ground. The roots of the tree go down very deeply into the rocky soil, and this fact may lie behind Deuteronomy 32:13 that refers to oil being sucked from the flinty rock. The tree takes about 15 years to grow to maturity, and then it bears fruit for centuries. The old roots often throw up new stems, which gave the prophet the picture of the stump of Jesse that throws up the Messiah. We watched a video, I think, of like the Nazarene replica, city of Nazarene replica place, and the guy's talking about the olive tree. And he's pointing out the new shoots, and that was what he was talking about, that Isaiah 11:1 reference. The new shoots were grafted into stalks. Paul says that when Christianity followed the Judaism of the Old Testament, then it was as if, contrary to normal practice, a wild olive were being grafted onto a cultivated stock. All right, page 105. Got a really good picture there. 19th century photograph of olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem. The name Gethsemane probably means oil press. So 19th century, that's an 1800 picture from the 1800s. All right, the olive tree. The olive tree is not attractive in itself. It's about 18 feet high when fully grown. The bark is gnarled, and the leaves have a dull green coloration. But they take on a silvery sheen in the sunshine, which probably made the tree appear beautiful to the people of Bible times. The tree is covered with white blossoms in the spring, and the falling blossoms look like a shower of snowflakes. The fruit is ready for picking by women and boys in September and October. A large cloth is laid under the tree, and the branches are beaten to shake the olives onto the cloth. In Old Testament times, those that did not fall had to be left on the tree for the poor to gather. The beating of the branches almost certainly destroyed the tender young shoots, so that there was a poor crop the following year. This resulted in alternate good and bad years for the crop. All right, olive oil. Olive oil took the place of butter and cooking fat, and so was crucial for diet. It therefore formed part of the meal offering. It was used as fuel for lamps, and when boiled with soda, it formed soap. Oil was used for rubbing into the skin to give it a shine, and for anointing the head to make the hair shine too. So there you've got, I think, 5 or 6 uses of olive oil. The beauty brought about by the oil may underlie the use of it in religious life, because those objects consecrated to God's service were anointed with oil. Okay, so the prophet, priest, and king were all anointed with oil because they were separated or consecrated for the service of God. So I would know that. It was the prophet, the priest, and the king that were all anointed with oil because they were separated or consecrated. I would know that word, consecrated, for the service of God. Ritual use was so important that it was an offense leading to excommunication to use holy anointing oil for a common purpose. And a person who had received such an anointing was to be obeyed. The prophet spoke to the people from God, the priest represented the people before God, and the king established God's law. So I would know that as well.
I'm sitting there thinking, this, you say you pull it from the middle out. That don't have one, does it?
The word for anoint is Messiah, and the Messiah is therefore the anointed one. Jesus gathered up into himself the triple function of prophet, priest, and king. Much symbolism is involved in this. Oil seems to have been recognized as the gift of God. An olive tree growing in a rocky place will yield an abundance of oil. Oil is therefore associated with God's gift and with God's outpouring of the Spirit. Jesus said that the Spirit of God was upon him because the Lord had anointed him. A person was consecrated to God by anointing because it was believed that the oil itself was from God, and because oil on the skin and on the hair made persons look their best. Christians too receive an anointing, which must also be the Holy Spirit because it results in learning God's truth. It talks about how the Holy Spirit will lead us into all truth. All right, now I wrote down that right here is another use of oil. Oil was also used for healing. When the Good Samaritan helped the man who had been mugged on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, he poured in oil and wine. The medicinal property might lie behind the use of oil in divine healing. Early Christians were told to anoint the sick with oil and to pray over them. Other people believed that the anointing was a means of consecrating or giving the sick person into God's care. Mark 6:13 tells us that when the 12 went out on a 2-by-2 ministry, they took oil for healing. The wood of the olive tree is used for small pieces of cabinet work and for wood carving. The gnarled state of the trunk makes it impossible to get beams. The wood is attractive, with dark grain against a yellowish background. The cherubim of the temple were made of olive wood together with the inner and outer doors. I got a pin that was gifted to me from a lady at a church in Louisiana, and the top part of it is made out of olive wood from Israel. And it is a very beautiful wood. Shields were oiled, so that's another use of oil there, is to oil shields, the leather, to keep the leather from cracking. This had the same function as leather preservative or shoe polish. All right, the olive press, back on page 108. Many olives were eaten with barley bread and constituted the normal breakfast for the working man. Preservation was made possible by immersing the olives in salt water. The main importance of the crop, however, was its oil. The olive press consisted of a flat cylindrical stone that was hollowed out on the top to provide a large, shallow saucer to contain the olives. Another stone wheel was set up on edge, and sometimes, aided by a donkey, it was rotated around the saucer, crushing the olives beneath it. The resultant pulp was then treated to extract the oil. Really good representation there in the picture to the left on page 109. One method of obtaining oil was by putting the pulp in baskets, one on top of the other, and squeezing them together in a press, either by operation of a screw thread or by a wooden beam that was levered down while thrusting against a wooden frame. Another method was to put the pulped olives into cloth bags that were then trodden underfoot. The oil came through the cloth. The oil released was drained into jars and allowed to stand until the sediment had settled. Then it was drawn off and stored in a cool place. The crop from just one tree would produce about 20 gallons of oil. Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives means the oil press, because there must have been a press there. It was possible to tread the olives like grapes in the press, but because olives were so much harder than grapes, little oil was produced this way. All right, very good. That's olives. Now on to fig trees. We're wrapping it up here. Fig trees were valued for their fruit and for their shade. So why do they like fig trees? Number one, because they taste good and they provided a lot of shade. Like the vine, fig trees became a symbol of security and of prosperity. When Jesus first met Nathanael, he was sitting under his fig tree. They grew wild, and in the wild state, the female fig blossoms had to be pollinated by a wasp that developed inside the inedible capra figs, which grew several times a year. When the fig tree was cultivated over a period of time, it did not need the insect pollination. The cultivated tree was often planted in a vineyard. If the tree was allowed to grow to its full height, it could reach 30 feet. But if it was on rocky soil or was cut back regularly, it could be limited to a bush. Figs, one of my favorite fruit to eat. My Mimi and Pawpaw, they're in Arkansas, they grow figs. They have a lot of different types of figs that they grow. They make money selling the fig trees that they do. They take cuttings off of their trees, and then they plant them, and then over the I think it's the winter, they keep them over at the shop, and they grow. They allow them to have a greenhouse too that they use, but it's really neat. They have some that are they're LSU Gold, and those are my favorites. And of course they preserve them and all that too. It's hard to beat a good fig. The leaves of the fig tree were large enough to serve as coverings for Adam and Eve. Remember, that's what they used to cover their nakedness. The leaves developed at the end of spring, at the end of April, and were therefore a sign that summer was approaching. Fruit could be found on the tree for about 10 months of the year. I would note that. For 10 months of the year, you could find fruit on the fig tree. The first ripe figs were ready in June, but the main crop matured in August. There was then a small crop of winter figs that often remained until the spring. The figs could be eaten fresh or pressed into a cake and preserved for drying. It was in this form that Hezekiah used the figs as a poultice. Back on page 111, we missed the opportunity there talking about the wood of the olive tree on page 111. Olive wood, model of the nativity from the Jerusalem souk. The wood of the olive tree is used for small pieces of cabinet work and wood carving. Remember, you don't get very much, you're not going to get a long beam of wood from an olive tree. It's all going to be small pieces. All right, the life cycle of fig trees in the green box there. It is not easy to relate to the biblical references. It is not easy to relate to the biblical references to the life cycle of the fig tree. The reference in the Song of Songs is probably to the first ripe figs because they are ready at the time that the vines are in blossom. The bad figs seen by Jeremiah may be the inedible male capra figs, which house the fig wasp while they develop. Jesus may have been looking either for remaining winter figs or for the first ripe figs. Whichever was missing indicated that the tree was infertile and would not give a main crop at the time at figs. Jesus confirmed its usefulness by causing its death. All right, and lastly, the sycamore tree. Another form of fruit tree similar to the fig was called the sycamore tree. And
the sycamore tree got fruits on?
I didn't know that either.
I didn't know until I read it in this book as well. In David's time, sycamores were numerous enough for him to appoint an overseer to look after them. It was from such a tree that Zacchaeus heard Jesus tell him to come down so that they could have a meal together. Again, the tree was about 30 feet in height and was grown for its timber, which was light and long-lasting, as well as for its fruit. Young trees were cut back to stimulate the growth of timber and multiple stands, and they were cut back after 7 years. The Mishnah allowed a man who rented a field with a sycamore tree in it to cut the limbs only in the first year of a 7-year lease. The economic importance of the tree was so great that when the Egyptians lost their trees through frost, it was a disaster. Amos was a dresser of sycamore fruit as well as a herdsman. All right, and then here's where we get to the fruit. Sycamore fruit needed to be pierced and wiped with oil if it was to become ripe and juicy. The owner of a sycamore plantation would allow a shepherd to graze his sheep under the trees in return for the shepherds undertaking this monotonous job. So if a shepherd needed a place for his sheep to graze, he'd go talk to the sycamore tree grower, and in turn, for allowing his sheep to.
That's
I feel like I've seen them too, but I didn't.
over here.
That one?
Yeah.
Maybe. No. I don't know if I've seen anything like that.
Yeah, I seen them thing on the sycamore tree. They got them in Mississippi, right? Yeah.
Don't get me lying, I don't know.
Let's Google.
Yeah, when did they grow? They got them in Mississippi.
I mean, we're about on the same parallel with them, longitude. So our climate's not probably super different from theirs. Of course, they're right on the water. We are too to the south, but. Inconclusive.
I don't know. I mean, it says it's native. Wait. The tree species that is native to North America. What is that?
That means it's from North America. It is a native species.
But it don't say nothing about Mississippi. Let's say.
It is native to North America, so it'd be. I guess I don't know. Is Mexico considered part of North America, or is that South?
That's North America.
Okay.
I
Well, I
think
know
it's
the
Canada,
states
United
are in
States,
Canada.
and Mexico, and I
Everything
think
above.
everything else is Central or
Yeah,
America.
that's Central. But, anywho, any questions on anything we talked about or comments? All right, so this has been chapter 7. Next week we'll test, or no test next week. Next week we'll go over chapter 8, collecting food. And if we make good time through that, we may do chapter 9 as well. And then the following week we'll test on chapter 7, and then spend the rest of the day in the library. That might be what we do for that. Alrighty. Online students, those that are taking the class for credit, make sure you are keeping up with the project that you got to do, the presentation on your artifact and replica. And if you have any questions about that, contact the school. I'd give my phone number, but, well, it's on the board, but comment and ask on the YouTube video, and I'm sure we'll see it. Anyway, y'all have a good one. God bless.
Recording again.